A queen carried something inside her womb for 40 years? When doctors finally cut her open after death, what they found turned to stone in their hands. By the end of this video, you'll discover where that calcified infant is buried today and why the medical world lost this knowledge for centuries. The year was 1538, and Queen Isabella stood before the royal court with her hands resting on her swollen belly, announcing the news that would secure her dynasty. At 28 years old, she was finally carrying the heir everyone had been waiting for. The kingdom erupted in celebration. Church bells rang from every tower in the capital. Tapestries were commissioned, depicting the unborn prince. Foreign ambassadors sent congratulations to their governments, reporting that the young queen's pregnancy would shift the balance of power across Europe. Coins were minted bearing Isabella's image with the inscription, "Mother of the Heir." But what no one knew, not even Isabella herself, was that this moment of joy would transform into a nightmare that would last 40 years. The child growing inside her would never draw breath, never cry, never open its eyes to see the world. Instead, it would become something medical science had never documented, something so horrifying that when it was finally discovered, physicians would choose to bury the truth rather than record it. The pregnancy that everyone celebrated would become the secret that consumed the queen's entire life. The first months passed with all the expected signs: morning sickness, swelling breasts, the gradual rounding of her belly that made courtiers bow even lower when she passed. Everything seemed perfectly normal, exactly as it should be. Around the 6th month, Isabella woke one morning and realized the movements had stopped. The quickening, that gentle fluttering she had grown to love, had vanished completely. She pressed her hands against her belly, trying to provoke a response from the child she carried. Nothing. She drank cold water, hoping the temperature change would make the baby shift and kick. Still nothing. By afternoon, terror had seized her completely, and she summoned Dr. Erasmus, her most trusted physician. He examined her carefully, his experienced hands pressing against her swollen abdomen, listening, searching for any sign of life. The other court physicians were called in, each one performing their own examination, each one growing more concerned by what they weren't finding. They tried every technique they knew to detect fetal movement. The queen's belly remained firm and swollen, exactly as it should be for a woman 6 months pregnant. But the baby inside wasn't moving. Dr. Erasmus tried to reassure her with explanations about quiet periods and resting babies, but Isabella could see the fear in his eyes. His voice lacked the conviction it usually carried. Something had gone terribly wrong, and what happened next would defy everything these experienced physicians thought they understood about pregnancy and the human body. Weeks turned into months, and the impossible situation continued. Isabella's body refused to acknowledge that the pregnancy had failed. Her belly stayed swollen, looking exactly like a woman carrying a child, but the life inside her had ceased. The physicians examined her daily, growing more baffled with each passing week. Every medical text they consulted said the same thing. When a baby died in the womb, the mother's body expelled it within days, maybe 2 weeks at most. That was natural law. That was how the human body worked. Dr. Erasmus pulled ancient manuscripts from the medical library, searching desperately for any recorded case that matched what they were witnessing. But Isabella's body wasn't following any known pattern. 8 months passed, then 9, then 10. The queen should have delivered months ago, yet there she stood, still appearing pregnant, still waiting for labor that would never come. The court began to whisper behind raised hands. Foreign ambassadors sent confused reports back to their kingdoms, unsure what to make of a queen who had been pregnant for nearly a year with no delivery. Some suggested she had miscalculated the conception date, but even the most generous estimates couldn't explain the delay. The most disturbing part wasn't just that the baby had died, it was that Isabella's body seemed unable to recognize its own failure, trapped in a biological loop that shouldn't be possible. And deep inside her womb, something unprecedented was beginning to happen. The meeting that would seal Isabella's fate took place in the royal council chamber on a cold winter morning. The queen sat at the head of the table, flanked by Dr. Erasmus and 3 of his most trusted colleagues, along with her closest advisors. They had to face an impossible truth. Isabella could not remain in this state indefinitely. She couldn't continue appearing in public with a belly that suggested advanced pregnancy while never actually delivering a child. The rumors were already damaging her reputation and threatening the stability of the crown. Whispers of witchcraft and divine punishment were beginning to circulate through the kingdom. After hours of painful discussion, they reached the only conclusion that seemed possible. They would lie. The queen would announce that she had miscarried during the night, that the physicians had examined the remains and performed all necessary procedures, and that she was now recovering from her loss. It was a carefully constructed deception designed to protect Isabella's reputation and end the speculation that was consuming the court. Her chief advisor argued that the truth would destroy her credibility as a ruler. But there was one problem with this plan. The thing inside Isabella's womb hadn't gone anywhere. Whatever had failed to be expelled was still there, still causing her belly to protrude slightly, still a physical reminder of the pregnancy that wouldn't end. The public announcement was made 3 days later in the throne room. Isabella, dressed in black mourning clothes that concealed her still swollen abdomen, stood before her assembled court and delivered the news in a voice that trembled with genuine grief. She had lost the child, she told them. The baby had died in her womb and been expelled during the night. Her physicians had confirmed it. There would be a period of mourning, and then she would resume her duties as queen. She spoke of her sorrow, of the emptiness she felt, words that were true even if the circumstances she described were false. The court responded with appropriate sympathy. Nobles sent gifts and letters of condolence. The kingdom lit candles in churches across the land, praying for their queen's recovery and future fertility. Foreign ambassadors reported back that the situation had been resolved, though some noted the unusual length of the pregnancy before the supposed miscarriage. No one suspected the truth. No one knew that Isabella's body still contained the failed pregnancy, that nothing had actually been expelled, that the lie they had just witnessed would need to be maintained for the rest of the queen's life. And as the mourning period ended and Isabella returned to her public duties, she began to understand the full weight of what she had done. She would carry this secret and this burden until the day she died. Living with the secret required constant vigilance. Isabella learned to dress in ways that concealed the slight protrusion of her lower abdomen. She avoided situations where she might be examined too closely. She endured the well-meaning advice of nobles who encouraged her to try for another child, never suspecting that the first pregnancy had never truly ended. Only 3 people knew the complete truth. Dr. Erasmus, who had attended her from the beginning, her most trusted lady-in-waiting, Lady Catherine, who helped her dress each morning and saw what the elaborate gowns concealed, and Isabella herself, who felt the weight of it every moment of every day. The other physicians who had been present during the examinations had been sent to distant posts with generous pensions and strong suggestions about the importance of discretion. Letters were sent to remind them periodically of their oaths of silence. The fewer people who knew, the safer the secret would be. But Isabella couldn't escape the physical reality of what her body contained. She could feel it when she moved, a heaviness low in her abdomen that shifted slightly with her steps. At night, alone in her chambers, she would sometimes place her hands on her belly and wonder what was happening inside her, why her body refused to let go of the failed pregnancy. The questions haunted her dreams and followed her through every waking hour. What Isabella couldn't know was that her body had begun an extraordinary process of self-preservation. Unable to expel the dead fetus through normal means, her body recognized it as a foreign object that posed a potential threat. In response, her immune system initiated a defensive mechanism that had rarely been documented in medical history. Calcium began to deposit around the fetal tissue, layer upon microscopic layer, slowly encasing the tiny corpse in a mineral shell. This process, which would later be called lithopedion formation, happened so gradually that Isabella never consciously noticed the change. The calcification worked from the outside in, creating a protective barrier that would prevent infection and decay. But over months and years, what had been soft fetal tissue was slowly transforming into something closer to stone. The process was similar to how pearls form in oysters, though far more complex and involving human tissue rather than sand. The calcification protected Isabella's body from infection and decay, effectively mummifying the fetus in a shell of calcium carbonate. It was a biological miracle that her body had found this solution, that it had somehow stumbled upon a way to preserve itself while containing the pregnancy that wouldn't end. But it came at a terrible cost that Isabella would pay for the next 40 years. 5 years after the phantom pregnancy, Isabella felt the first real change. The heaviness in her abdomen had become harder, more solid. What had once shifted slightly when she moved now felt fixed in place, as though it had fused with her internal organs. She mentioned this to Dr. Erasmus during a private examination, and he felt the mass through her abdominal wall with growing concern. It no longer felt like tissue, he told her quietly. It felt almost like bone or stone. He pressed harder, trying to determine the exact nature of what he was feeling. He had no explanation for what was happening, no treatment to offer, no medical precedent to guide him. All he could do was monitor her condition and pray that whatever was occurring inside her didn't cause more serious complications. The calcification continued, invisible and unstoppable. 10 years passed, then 15, then 20. Isabella's body adapted to carrying the stone baby, compensating for the mass in her abdomen, shifting her posture and gait to accommodate the weight. She walked with a slight forward lean that people attributed to back problems. She had other pregnancies during this time, some successful, others that ended in true miscarriages. But the first child, the one that had died at 6 months and never left her body, remained. It was slowly transforming into a calcified monument to failed motherhood, a tiny statue of unborn life that she would carry until her dying day. The psychological toll of carrying the secret was perhaps worse than the physical burden. Isabella watched her living children grow, celebrated their birthdays, arranged their marriages, and saw them have children of their own. But she never stopped thinking about the first child, the one that had never drawn breath, the one that was still inside her after all these years. She sometimes spoke to it in the privacy of her chambers, whispered apologies and explanations, told it about the siblings it would never meet and the kingdom it would never inherit. She wondered if it was a boy or girl, what it would have looked like, what kind of person it might have become. Lady Catherine, her faithful attendant, was the only person who witnessed these moments, and she never spoke of them to anyone. The stone baby had become more than just a medical condition to Isabella. It had become a companion of sorts, a constant presence that had been with her longer than her husband, longer than any of her living children. She developed a strange protective attachment to it, even as she grieved what it represented. When courtiers asked why she sometimes moved stiffly or why she occasionally pressed her hand to her lower abdomen with a distant expression, she blamed old injuries or digestive complaints. No one suspected the truth. No one could imagine what she was hiding beneath her elaborate gowns and forced smiles. The loneliness of her secret was crushing at times. 30 years after the pregnancy that never ended, King Ferdinand died, leaving Isabella as the sole ruler of the kingdom. She was 58 years old, her children were grown, and she had successfully navigated decades of political intrigue without anyone discovering her secret. But the physical burden was becoming harder to hide. The calcified mass in her abdomen was now pressing against other organs, causing digestive issues and occasional pain that even the strongest medicines couldn't fully relieve. Her physicians, a new generation who had never known about the original pregnancy, were baffled by her symptoms. They proposed various diagnoses, tumors, digestive blockages, problems with her womb. Some suggested stones had formed in her organs, though they couldn't explain why or where. Isabella listened to their theories and nodded politely, but she never told them the truth. Dr. Erasmus had died 5 years earlier, taking his knowledge to the grave. His final words to Isabella had been a promise that her secret was safe. Lady Catherine was the only person left who knew the full story, and she was bound by decades of loyalty and affection to keep the Queen's secret. As Isabella entered her 60s, she began to think more seriously about what would happen when she died. Would the secret die with her? Or would someone discover the stone baby when they prepared her body for burial? The uncertainty kept her awake at night. The thought of discovery both terrified and fascinated Isabella. Part of her wanted the truth to remain buried forever, for her reputation to remain intact, for history to remember her as a successful queen rather than as a medical curiosity. But another part of her, the part that had carried this burden for 4 decades, wanted someone to know. She wanted someone to understand what she had endured, the physical and emotional weight she had borne in silence while ruling a kingdom and raising a family. She wanted physicians to know that such a thing was possible, that a body could contain a failed pregnancy for decades, that calcium could turn dead tissue into stone. The knowledge she carried could potentially help other women who found themselves in similar situations, though she knew such cases must be incredibly rare. She had never heard of another woman experiencing anything like this. Late at night, when sleep eluded her and she lay in her chambers with one hand resting on the hard mass in her abdomen, Isabella would imagine the moment of discovery. She pictured physicians cutting open her body, their shock and amazement at finding the calcified fetus, their rush to document this unprecedented medical phenomenon. The fantasy gave her a strange comfort, a sense that her suffering might have meaning beyond her own experience. Perhaps her burden could become knowledge that would help future generations. In her 67th year, Isabella fell seriously ill with a fever that wouldn't break. Her physicians tried every treatment they knew, bleeding her, applying poultices, administering herbs and medicines that made her retch. Nothing helped. The fever persisted, sapping her strength and leaving her bedridden for weeks. As she lay weak and trembling, she became convinced that this was the beginning of the end. She was dying, and soon the secret she had carried for 40 years would either be discovered or buried with her. The thought filled her with a desperate urgency. She summoned Lady Catherine to her bedside and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. When she died, Isabella told her faithful attendant, Lady Catherine must ensure that the royal physicians examined her body thoroughly. She must tell them about the pregnancy that never ended, about the mass that had been slowly calcifying inside her womb for 4 decades. She wanted them to cut her open and see what she had carried all these years. Lady Catherine wept as she promised to honor the Queen's wishes, knowing that this meant revealing a secret they had both guarded for most of their adult lives. Against all expectations, Isabella recovered from the fever. Her body wasn't ready to give up yet, but she knew her time was running short, and she made more concrete plans for what would happen after her death. She wanted the truth known, even if it came at the cost of her reputation. By her 68th year, Isabella's body was failing in ways that couldn't be ignored any longer. The stone baby, which had remained relatively stable for decades, was now causing serious complications. Her aging body no longer had the strength to compensate for the mass pressing against her organs. She experienced severe abdominal pain that left her gasping and unable to stand upright. Eating became nearly impossible. Food seemed to aggravate whatever was inside her, causing violent cramping and nausea that lasted for hours. Her weight dropped dramatically everywhere except her abdomen, which remained distended with the calcified mass. She looked like a woman in the final stages of starvation, her face gaunt and her limbs wasted, yet her belly protruded as though she were pregnant. The contrast was grotesque and deeply disturbing to anyone who saw her. Courtiers whispered about the Queen's strange condition, but none dared ask directly what was wrong. Her personal physicians were at a loss to explain her condition. They could feel the hard mass when they examined her abdomen, but they had no context for what it might be. Some suggested it was a large tumor. Others thought it might be a severe intestinal blockage. One physician proposed that stones had somehow formed throughout her digestive system. None of them could imagine the truth. Isabella's breathing became labored as the mass pressed upward against her diaphragm. She could no longer lie flat in bed, needing to be propped up on pillows just to draw enough air into her lungs. Sleep came in brief, fitful periods, interrupted by pain and breathlessness. She knew she was dying, and she knew it wouldn't be long now. She called for her family, said goodbye to her children and grandchildren, distributed gifts and final blessings. Each conversation was painful, knowing she was keeping the truth from them even now. But she saved her most important conversation for Lady Catherine, the woman who had helped her hide the truth for 40 years. In the flickering candlelight of her chambers, with death creeping closer every day, Isabella made her final request. She wanted her body examined after death. Not the cursory preparation that usually preceded royal burial, but a thorough medical examination. She wanted physicians to see what she had carried, to understand what her body had endured, to document this incredible thing that had happened to her. She made Lady Catherine swear on everything holy that she would honor this wish. Lady Catherine tried to argue against it, worried about what such a revelation might mean for Isabella's legacy. But the Queen was adamant. The knowledge was too important to die with her. Medical science needed to know that this was possible, that a body could preserve a failed pregnancy for an entire lifetime. It was her final gift to the world. On a cold autumn morning in 1578, exactly 40 years after the pregnancy that never ended, Queen Isabella died. She was 68 years old, and she had ruled her kingdom with wisdom and strength, despite the secret burden she carried. Her last words, whispered to Lady Catherine as dawn broke over the palace, were simple and heartbreaking. "Let them see," she said. "Let them finally see what I've carried all these years." And then she closed her eyes for the last time, her hand resting on the hard mass in her abdomen, the stone baby that had been her constant companion for 4 decades. Her face in death showed a strange peace that hadn't been there during her final suffering weeks. Lady Catherine kept her promise. Before the court could make arrangements for the standard royal burial, she summoned 3 of the most trusted physicians in the kingdom to the Queen's private chambers. She told them there was something they needed to see, something that would challenge everything they thought they understood about medicine and the human body. She explained, with tears streaming down her face, about the pregnancy 40 years ago that had never truly ended. The physicians were confused but intrigued. They had treated Isabella for years without being able to explain her symptoms. Perhaps an examination after death would finally provide answers. None of them were prepared for what they were about to discover. The examination took place in Isabella's chambers, with heavy curtains drawn and guards posted outside to ensure complete privacy. Dr. Sebastian, the senior royal physician, made the first incision down the center of Isabella's abdomen. The moment his scalpel cut through the skin and muscle, he knew something was wrong. There was an unusual resistance, a hardness where there should have been soft tissue. He exchanged glances with his colleagues, Dr. Marcus and Dr. Alfonso, both of whom had felt the strange mass during their examinations of the living queen. As they carefully peeled back the layers of abdominal wall, the smell hit them. Not the usual odor of a recently deceased body, but something old and strange, like limestone and decay mixed together. It was unlike anything they had encountered in their medical careers. And then they saw it. Nestled in Isabella's lower abdomen, surrounded by organs that had been pushed aside to accommodate its presence, was a mass roughly the size of a newborn infant. But it wasn't tissue, it wasn't a tumor. It wasn't anything they had ever encountered in their medical careers. It was hard, calcified, covered in a rough shell of mineral deposits that gleamed dully in the candlelight. For a long moment, none of the physicians could speak. They simply stared at this impossible thing that had been hidden inside their queen. Dr. Sebastian reached out tentatively, almost afraid to touch it. Dr. Sebastian reached out with trembling hands and touched the surface of the calcified mass. It felt like stone, rough and solid beneath his fingers. He pressed harder and the shell didn't give at all. Whatever this was, it had been inside Isabella for a very long time. With infinite care, the three physicians began the process of extracting the mass from Isabella's body. It had fused to surrounding tissue, and they had to cut through attachments that had formed over decades. The connections were so extensive that it was clear the queen's body had grown around this thing, accommodating it, incorporating it into her very structure. As they worked, the shape of the thing became clearer. It had a definite form, not the random irregularity of a tumor. There were curves and indentations that suggested structure, organization, purpose. And then Dr. Marcus, who was working on freeing one end of the mass, made a discovery that caused him to gasp audibly. "Dear God," he whispered, "I can feel bone structure." The other two physicians leaned in closer, their candles casting flickering shadows across the calcified surface. Dr. Marcus was right. Beneath the rough exterior of calcium deposits, they could feel the unmistakable shape of tiny bones. A spine. Ribs. The curve of a skull. This wasn't just a mass, this was a baby. Or rather, it had been a baby before calcium had turned it into stone. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The full horror of what they were witnessing crashed over the three physicians like a wave. They were looking at a calcified fetus, a baby that had died in the womb and somehow been preserved inside the queen's body for decades. The implications were staggering. This meant Isabella had been pregnant, the pregnancy had failed, and instead of miscarrying normally, her body had encased the dead fetus in calcium, turning it into this stone monument to lost life. Dr. Sebastian's hands shook as he continued the extraction, finally freeing the calcified mass from Isabella's body cavity. He held it up to the candlelight, and all three physicians could see it clearly now. The rough outline of a baby, frozen in the position it had died in, curled in on itself, its tiny form perfectly preserved beneath layers of mineral deposits. They could make out the curve of the spine, the suggestion of limbs tucked against the torso, even the rounded shape of the skull. It was approximately 6 months along in development, which meant Isabella had been carrying this inside her for 40 years. 40 years. The number was almost incomprehensible. This woman had lived her entire adult life, ruled a kingdom, had other children, attended court functions, made political decisions, all while carrying a calcified baby in her womb. The sheer strength of a will that must have required left the physicians speechless. They had never imagined such a thing was possible. Dr. Sebastian carefully placed the stone baby on a clean cloth and stepped back, trying to process what they had just discovered. This was without question the most extraordinary medical finding of their careers, possibly of the century. A case of lithopedion, though they didn't have that term yet, wouldn't be coined for another 100 years. This was proof that the human body was capable of things medical science had never imagined. It could preserve a failed pregnancy indefinitely, could turn flesh and bone into mineral, could adapt to carrying such a burden for decades without killing the host. The implications for understanding human anatomy and physiology were enormous. The knowledge they now possessed could revolutionize medical understanding of pregnancy, miscarriage, and the body's defensive mechanisms. They could write papers, present their findings to medical societies, change the way physicians thought about failed pregnancies. But even as these thoughts raced through Dr. Sebastian's mind, he felt a cold dread settling over him. This knowledge was dangerous. Not medically dangerous, but politically and socially dangerous. If word spread about what they had found inside the Queen, if people learned that Isabella had been carrying a dead baby for 40 years, the consequences would be catastrophic for her legacy and reputation. The Catholic Church might declare her cursed. Protestant enemies would use it as propaganda. The three physicians stood in the candlelit chamber, staring at the calcified fetus, and silently acknowledged the terrible decision that lay before them. Dr. Marcus was the first to speak. "This cannot become public knowledge," he said quietly. "The Queen's reputation would be destroyed. People would say she had been cursed or that she had hidden a pregnancy that should have been announced and properly mourned. The religious authorities would have questions we couldn't answer. They might declare her body unfit for burial in consecrated ground. The entire royal line could be cast into doubt." Dr. Alfonso nodded slowly. "And yet this is a medical discovery of immense importance. There must be other women somewhere who have experienced something similar. If we document this case, if we share what we've learned, we could help future physicians understand and treat such conditions. We could save lives. We could advance medical knowledge by decades." Dr. Sebastian listened to both arguments, feeling the weight of responsibility crushing down on him. He looked at the stone baby, then at Isabella's peaceful face, and thought about what Lady Catherine had told them before the examination. The Queen wanted them to see this, wanted the truth to be known, wanted medical science to benefit from her suffering. But he also understood that the world wasn't ready for this truth. Society would destroy Isabella's memory rather than celebrate her strength. The decision was made in whispered conference, with the door locked and Lady Catherine standing guard outside. They would document what they had found, but only in the most minimal way. Dr. Sebastian would make a brief entry in his private medical journal, noting the discovery of a calcified mass of unusual formation in the Queen's abdomen. No mention of it being a fetus. No details about the 40-year timeline. No description that might lead future readers to understand the full truth. The entry would be deliberately vague, protecting Isabella while preserving at least a hint of what they had discovered. The calcified baby itself would be placed in a sealed wooden box and buried with Isabella, hidden in her coffin where no one would ever find it. The three physicians would take an oath of silence, swearing never to discuss what they had seen with anyone outside this room. It was the only way to protect Isabella's reputation, to preserve the dignity of the crown, and to prevent the kind of scandal that could echo through history. Dr. Marcus carefully wrapped the stone baby in silk cloth, treating it with a reverence usually reserved for holy relics. In a way, it was sacred. This tiny calcified body represented 40 years of secret suffering, a mother's burden carried with silent dignity through an entire lifetime. His hands trembled as he worked. They placed it in the wooden box and sealed it with wax, marking it with symbols that meant nothing to anyone but themselves. It would go to the grave with the woman who had carried it. Before we reveal what happened to that sealed box and where it might be today, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel right now because we're the only ones bringing you these buried historical truths that powerful institutions have tried to keep hidden for centuries. The story of Queen Isabella and her stone baby was suppressed for over 400 years, and there are dozens more secrets like this waiting to be uncovered. When you subscribe, you're joining a community dedicated to revealing real history, not the sanitized version they teach in schools. Drop a comment below telling us what shocked you most about Isabella's story, because your engagement shows YouTube that these hidden truths deserve to be seen. Every comment pushes this video higher in the algorithm, reaching more people who need to know these stories. And smash that like button if you believe historical secrets like this one need to be exposed, no matter how disturbing they might be. Every like pushes this video to more people who are ready to know the real stories behind the royal portraits and official records. Your support literally determines whether these suppressed histories reach the masses or remain buried. Now let me tell you what happened to Isabella's tomb and the stone baby that rests within it. The official cause of Isabella's death was recorded as natural decline in old age complicated by digestive ailments. The funeral was held with appropriate ceremony, and Isabella's body was laid to rest in the royal crypt beneath the cathedral in the capital city. The sealed wooden box containing the stone baby was placed at her feet inside the lead-lined coffin, exactly as the three physicians had planned. Lady Catherine attended the funeral, the only person besides the physicians who knew what was truly being buried that day. She watched as the coffin was lowered into the crypt, knowing that Isabella's greatest secret was going with her. She never spoke of Isabella's secret again, taking the knowledge to her own grave 15 years later. Dr. Sebastian lived another 23 years, but he never forgot what he had seen that night in the Queen's chambers. His private journal, discovered after his death, contained the cryptic entry about the calcified mass, but without context. Later physicians dismissed it as a vague note about a tumor. Dr. Marcus and Dr. Alfonso both died within a decade of Isabella, taking their secrets with them. On his deathbed, Dr. Marcus reportedly tried to confess what he had seen, but his words were incoherent and dismissed as fever dreams. The stone baby, sealed in its wooden box and buried in a lead coffin beneath tons of stone, seemed destined to remain hidden forever. The secret appeared to have died with everyone who knew it. But here's where the story takes its final haunting turn. In 1893, over 300 years after Isabella's death, construction work beneath the cathedral revealed the royal crypt. Officials opened several tombs to document and preserve the remains of ancient monarchs. When they reached Isabella's coffin, they found it had been damaged by water seepage over the centuries. The lead lining had corroded in places, and the wooden box at the foot of the coffin had partially deteriorated. Inside that box, workers found something that confused them completely. A rough stone-like object about the size of a baby, covered in calcium deposits and wrapped in rotted silk. They couldn't identify what it was, they had no context for its significance, and the journal entry from Dr. Sebastian had long been forgotten in some dusty archive. So they did what seemed logical at the time. They resealed it in a new container and returned it to the crypt with Isabella's remains, assuming it was some kind of religious relic or royal treasure they didn't understand. A brief note was made in the restoration records about an unidentified calcified object, but no further investigation was conducted. To this day, that stone baby still lies in the cathedral crypt, buried with the queen who carried it for 40 years. The full truth of what it is and what it represents has never been officially recognized. And unless someone reopens that tomb and examines the calcified fetus with modern medical knowledge, the physical proof of one of history's most incredible medical cases will remain hidden in darkness, waiting to tell its story to anyone brave enough to listen. Isabella's burden rests with her still, a secret sealed in stone and silence.